Welcome back, folks, to the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills and Self-Improvement Project podcast with your host, me, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, also a licensed professional counselor and an adjunct professor at a local community college. Today's topic of discussion is going to be the reward pathways of the brain and how that, in effect, is adjusted by how we interact with our environment, and also those things that we tend to become very enamored of or liking of, or maybe even a little dependent and addicted to. And I say a little in jest, but what I am very seriously talking about is the fact that much of what we do is a hedonic response, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and the things that we do are driven by a number of neurotransmitters and hormones in our body that cause us to motivate in the direction of those things that can be safe or life engendering, those things that give us a signal to say, hey, I survive, I live, therefore I thrive and win. Once again, not points on the board, but rather above ground suck and win. That means you're breathing and you're not in the ground or about to be, or somebody's lunch for that matter, something for that matter. So in a very realistic life or death sense, what does this mean when we talk about reward pathways relative to our behaviors when we interact in this modern, socialized, really soft, cushiony society where we don't have to run around killing our food? Very few of us have to do that. We go to the store and pick it up, or those things that we eat aren't necessarily requiring us to hunt down for days the way we used to maybe 100,000 years ago. So to put things in perspective, these reward pathways, we're going to describe them relative to what science backs up, but also the behavior, what we see and observe that you may have seen, and also those opinions that we have as a result of what we see that often are driven by something much deeper than just merely an ethical lack or a character weakness or moral lacking somehow. Because the physiology of our body will definitely drive what it is that we do before we ever are able to think about it at the higher brain level. And it's a very deep thing. It's not particularly mysterious, but mysterious in the power that it holds over us whenever we try to make behavioral change, especially when those behaviors are dangerous to us, hurtful to us, or unhealthy, or have caused things that have been very socially deleterious to our social paradigm, as in gambling, for instance, wherever we may gamble away our home, our finances, and our holdings, because the drive to win and that expectation of winning is so distorted that we don't realize that it is a variable pay schedule and it is not regular like a paycheck, so to speak. Not that that's perfectly so, but in comparison, it makes a good point to keep those as contrasts there. But yet the power to do that and the big win, so to speak, can become very deeply ingrained in us, so to speak, that we can't not do that. And once again, it is not a moral, ethical failing, but those things that drive us, we tend to look at it as, I'm not taking care of my family or my home, my tribe, this sort of thing, so I have failed. If we look at it from the opinionated higher mind sense, and that is a very heady perspective, mind you. But when we look at things with a deeper lens, seeing things how they are versus what we opine them to be or hope they are or judge them as based on our own feelings and fears and losses and lacks, then we have a more defined sense of what is actually happening and how much control we may not have whenever people tell us, get a handle on it, get a grip, not realizing that that is metaphor for something that is conceptual, but yet it has no power to change or shape the behavior, the objective behaviors that we're seeing measurably on the outside. Going to the casino, for instance, 3 times out of the week, we can count that. That's a behavior, so that therefore it's an objective, measurable thing. But yet the feelings that we get from it are somewhat negative. So shifting gears a little bit, why do we want to talk about this today relative to self-regulation? One thing is understanding. We have to understand what happens to us. Now, dopamine is an amazing neurotransmitter, but it's something that's gained quite a bit of media following as of late. in the last 10 years, anything on YouTube involving dopamine has some really big hitters there. Dr. Andrew Huberman, I use a lot of his videos to help educate folks on the dopamine pathway relative to addiction. Also, Dr. Ann Lemke and her take on the dopamine pathways and dopamine fasting. Not that you truly stop dopamine per se, but rather where you stop the behaviors wherever you're rewarding yourself with easy things, not unlike a cell phone where we get reward whenever we're doing, let's say, net surfing on our cell phone, where the hit is immediate and the colors and the vibration of the phone whenever it rings, all those things are little hits, little payoffs that make the experience of holding or interacting with our cell phone enjoyable on top of what it is information wise we're getting. So it's a double whammy, so to speak. So it's a very complex, well marketed thing. It's not an evil thing per se, but definitely it has been marketed to us in a way that it lights up our reward pathways. Not unlike whenever we were on the plane hunting and we get a fatty piece of meat. For those of you that do not eat vegetation, hey, I applaud you. For those that do, this isn't meant to offend you. I'm just making a point to the fact that veganism is a new thing. We were never vegan per se, and I'm not flying against veganism or vegetarianism. But the animal fats, we do know that this is science backed that that actually creates satiety if we had it in our diet long time ago. Of course, a long time ago we didn't have to worry about pesticides or worry about anything along the lines of foods that were synthesized or somehow processed that gave us inflammation. We had bigger things to worry about. And whenever we put things in context, that paradigm shift gives us a really clear idea as to what happens to us whenever we are doing something that engages that reward pathway. So, what I'm going to cite here is from the biobehavioral sciences and also from psychology, sociology, and also those that study social dynamics that I think is really fascinating, such as pickup artists that think that they've got a corner on this market. But whenever we have the drives of life, we have what are jokingly sometimes called the four F's. F, the letter in the alphabet, being the one that's most fun when we get upset and drop an F bomb, so to speak. But whenever we're talking about the four F's, we're talking about the fight, flight response, those are two. But there's also the feed response that has to do with alimenting ourselves, eating and nourishing ourselves and getting base nutrients to be able to grow, heal, live, recover, and go on to the next hunting cycle, which is the following day if we make it that far. But the four F's cover that. The fourth F rather, is sex. I didn't want to drop the F bomb, but that is the joke within the F's whenever we discuss them, and we have a nice little laugh about that. But also we have a freeze response that is something that is kind of like a half F to me, somewhere within the confines of the area of the fight flight response. So those fight flight freeze are usually coupled in a sense. But we all tend to have a freeze response till we orient in many cases whenever there's a stimulus that jumps at us. But back to what it is we're doing as far as the reward pathway. So, why do I have to tell you about these? All of these have to do with something that generates a behavior that encourages us to be a better survivor and live. And living is the best of all payoffs whenever you could have easily passed, been eaten, gotten injured, or died. So, keeping these things in that lens, what's the next part about this reward pathway that we have to discuss? Well, there is one portion that often is understood to be something that when we're eating, we're aware of, and that's called the cephalic phase of eating. And that's whenever we actually think or imagine or encourage our mind to think about something that we may expect to eat. If you remember eating oranges or going and gathering food at a certain grocery or at a certain restaurant, you remember where to get that food, especially if it hits your gullet and then all of a sudden that tasted really good. And somewhere inside there's some sense of joy and satisfaction. And then we can say that we've had some dopamine response. We have this feeling of, I'm going to do that again. We may not even say it that way. We might say it to the people that we're eating with, oh, this is really good. I think I'm going to come back and do this again. That was really good. Often our verbiage, once the signal splits off, will be that of encouraging ourselves to do this again because we have that satiety factor that's going on. Also, that pleasure factor, how we enjoyed the food. Also, we are starting to make plans about in the future how I'm going to do this again. How am I going to recapture this experience of goodness that I just had? So the cephalic phase of eating often isn't even the verb part. It's whenever we're still at the level of wordless mind at the lower brain, where in the occipital area we're interpreting visual signal whenever we see the food coupled with the experience of the gustation, our taste, the smell, the touch of it, and the whole ambiance. But then after the fact, if you're not near the food, just the recalling of it, it's a visual memory recall. Often people will say that they can even smell the food when they have a recall, and that is rather fascinating. We know that the memories that degrade the slowest are the ones that have to do with the taste and smell, but the vision is very powerful as well. So they get innervated in the areas that have to do with our survival response, eating well, eating successfully, and having motivation to do those things that smell good, taste good, and make us stronger. So whenever we're talking about reward pathway, this is where we're going to use the term the highway to heaven in quotes and the highway to hell. My highway to hell. We have one. It's not always bad. It can be exceedingly good, but even then, we can distort this wherever we start seeking the good so intensely that I want to eat the sweet, the good, the satisfying, the fatty, the tasty. Or we start seeking things that marketing has made our taste buds really sensitive to, and that is hyper palatable foods. We start seeking Doritos that are off the scale for taste, and when you taste them, they don't taste all that good, but the shock value of it to our taste buds, it's hard to stop because it has the right balance of flavor. Also, it has the right balance of salt, what our body needs. And those are the things that, when they're coupled a certain way, they shock all the right buttons, so to speak, and they make us remember that, and we start doing that. Couple that with drinking a soda with lots of sugar, extra sweet. There's nothing in nature that is going to be that sweet, or Dorito salty, or even flavored that way. Those things are not naturally occurring, but yet whenever we ingest them, our body remembers with such intensity we can't not do that again. Try to just eat one chip. Lay's talks about that. Perfect taste, perfect level of saltiness to make it such that it's light enough that you have that flavor, but it's not satisfying enough because it's not a potato. It's merely a little sliver of a potato, salted to a degree that it makes you reach for it again. Lots of research has gone into this, and they market to us, and we buy. We can't help it. And our behavior, how much we spend, tells them to keep doing that because they're getting wealthy by virtue of the fact that they're lighting our reward pathways up. So the cephalic phase of eating is very important for us because from this point it's a reference point now. What does this have to do with self-regulatory behavior? Well, I will give you a little bit of an anecdote, a story of my own, a little bit of my own narrative. Several years back, during the time that we were experiencing shutdowns here in the United States due to COVID, I was very isolated, and I would go out and work. I was one of the necessary workers allowed to work. Go to work, use a mask, go to and forth, and to and fro to work. And whenever I would go home and eat, I would work out. But I started doing what was called carnivore diet, and I'm not waving the flag of carnivore or anything against vegetable eating or anything like that. I'm just merely repeating my experience because I was noting that I was having inflammation and joint pain that was limiting what I was able to do sometimes because I work out 3 times a week. I do kettlebells and club bells, and I have this March will be 8 years of continuous working out without stopping, where I have no less than 3 workouts a week, doing resistance workout to help regulate blood sugar and other things as I age. I want to maintain mobility, and I do martial arts, that kind of helps. But whenever I was doing the carnivore diet, one thing I realized is that after cleansing my palate, so to speak, just eating meat, fat, water, unsweet coffee, unsweet tea, and that was really it. Those were my libations, mostly water. is what I would drink. And no added anything, no sauces or anything, just strictly just the meat, the fat, that's it. And I would eat tuna, I would eat whitefish, I would eat turkey, chicken, pork, beef, all of these things, but only meat. And I wound up losing something along the lines of 55 pounds. And I've always been a bit heavy, but I dropped down to about 208. And then I started dropping into the 190 ranges at my lightest. And I carry most of the one I used to whenever I was in high school. So I really had a good effect. I felt very healthy, felt good, but I realized that I was very sensitive to white flour, to grains, because I'd eaten them so much. So there were a number of other foods that I was really reluctant to eat. And I started folding food in over probably about a year and a half and realized that I had regained my palate. I liked eating fresh fruit. I was eating clean for a long time after that, for several years, and I still do mostly eat clean. I need to tighten that up again because I've been deconditioning due to an injury. But what I want to point out is that you can regain your palate to where you want to eat just natural whole foods. And the cleaner you eat, the better. And what I wanted to add to this is the fact that that cephalic phase of eating became less sensitive. It became less over the top, where it would not nearly bowl me over the way it used to whenever I drive by a place that I knew that had ice cream or salty food or fried chicken, that I didn't quickly want to start driving, where my body felt like it wanted to drive on its own. I still had distinct senses of feeling my spine aroused. And the spinal reflex is something that requires no thinking. The signal goes out, pain withdrawal. But I just remember this wasn't pain withdrawal. Wherever my spine would wake up, I would arch, almost I would get excited. The closest approximation to that experience was I remember being a child and playing tag and running. And whenever I could see the person chasing me, their fingers just like inches away, where you're almost on tiptoes running as fast as you can away and your back starts to arch, I would feel that. It was a very tingling, pleasurable, anticipatory response sensation that even whenever I was away from foods like that for a while, I would still get that. Almost like my body was trying to override my best thinking and strategizing for my long term health. And whenever we have that kind of a drive, we have to understand that it has no sense of planning for the future, even if it's healthy for you. Taking a quick drink here, but the reason I'm pointing this out is that the cephalic aspect of those things that we get dependent on, that we consume, addiction, that includes things that are electronic behavioral process addictions, porn, whenever we start seeking certain types of stimuli that get our attention that may or may not have to do with our immediate safety or survival, but they're pleasure inducing to the point where we start to use them excessively. And some of us have a hard time telling when we've reached our pleasure limit. There are those of us here in the United States that have certain genetics that make us overly sensitive, or let me say more correctly, vulnerable to the use of alcohol, to where we don't know when to stop. We can't tell whenever we've been inebriated or when we've been affected to a point where, okay, that's enough, to the point that we will drink to intoxication of a level that is poisoning, and then hospitalization and possible death. So these are some really important things to pay attention to. But whenever we have pleasure, that we have this sense of I can keep adding and doing more, and more is better. And that's not a conscious sense that says more is better when you know that you're drinking something that's not good for you. But your body's saying, I don't feel the effects. That's wherever we have this sense of problem that often we don't get a sense of as the consumer, but rather the observer. And our peers may be the ones that tell us don't do this. When we have levels of morbid obesity, many times we have stuff like this. When we have levels of isolation, wherever things become so painful interacting with people, that we have a clinical level of isolation that we can't bring somebody out, that somebody will literally uh, become a hermit because it's so uncomfortable to be out and about. We have the inverse of that, wherever it may not be pleasurable, but it's a whole hell of a lot better not being somewhere where I'm getting overstimulated in a way that I can't handle, where I go into the anxious panic fight flight response. And we will often have that cephalic quality where people will give themselves a narrative and they start imagining what could happen, even though it hasn't happened. But the feelings based on the images that we bring up often are enough to incite the fight, flight, or low level to where it's like, no, I can't do that. And we back off and we believe that narrative, that picture story we told ourselves, and then we rationalize it's better if we don't do this, and then we don't engage with life, this sort of thing. So my highway to heaven, man, it tastes good, feels good. And that's when we get introduced to those things that give us that dopamine payoff. When it becomes the highway to hell is when I can't stop it. When I can't regulate my behavior, it says, I know this is bad for me, but I keep doing it. Wherever I start letting things go and it becomes more of an addiction, I let things go such as family obligations. It doesn't mean that you're incapable of loving, but that need to balance what the body feels it needs to survive, like water and air. Whatever we addicted to, uses the same pathways that we live with. The breather, the system that we breathe with, our eater and drinker that allows us to aliment and hydrate. Those are the same pathways that give us dopamine when we do things that give us life. And they're the same pathways that we use when we start becoming dependent on things that are dangerous to us, that become toxic to us, not just in what we ingest, but what we do behaviorally and what can cause a breakdown of family and social structures where we can lose jobs and even a sense of self-efficacy. I can't do anything for myself or self-respect. And these are some very important things, how I see myself. When we have a healthy sense wherever we utilize that cephalic phase, that visualization phase that causes what we would call the high before the high, when we're in pursuit, when we're following, when we're seeking, whether it be drugs, whether it be food, whether it be sex, whether it be gambling, whether it be payoff, or doing those things that excite me. Whenever we are doing those seeking behaviors, this is called goal-directed behavior. But these are the things that, even though you don't have the substance in hand, or the payoff in hand, or the behavior, or the food, or whatever it is that might give you that pleasure, whenever you're on the way to get it, when you've thought about it, there's that really delicious, exciting, sharp, shocking, attention-getting, you got to go get this motivating feeling that motivates the behavior, the goal-directed behavior. I'm going to get that steak. I'm going to get that food. I'm going to get that substance or do that behavior that brings me such pleasure and excitement and the possibility of the big win. These are the things we have to be careful with. That is dopamine. That's the high before the high. But what most people don't talk about when they talk about this is that there's a letdown. What if you don't get the drug, the substance, the food, or the behavior to do that? There's no relief of that anticipation. There is anxiety, there is anger, there's upset, there's irritation, there's depression, and for some, there's even suicide. So this can be a very dangerous thing. The cephalic phase brings our picture into our eyesight of the mind, and then we start looking and saying, I want that, in a very basic physiological sense. But then we start pursuing, and when we can't pursue, that is like a failed hunt. You don't hunt, you don't eat. And if you fail in the hunt, you don't eat. And if we equate it to that, we realize the importance of when we start to use artificial behaviors, or external behaviors, I should say, that stimulate those pathways, we can get stuck. We can get to a point wherever we overuse, especially if the behavior is easy, like picking up a cell phone. So we tend to be more apt to become a user of those behaviors, especially if that's one of the few things that gives us pleasure and I have a sense of control. Whenever outside job's hard, I have no authority, and I can't change those things that make me feel uncomfortable. So it becomes no longer the highway to heaven pleasure, but it transforms into that highway to hell that I have to do. And I know it's not good for me, and I'm hurting myself, and I'm hurting my loved ones or those that were around me, or maybe isolated because they left me because it was so painful for them to watch. And now it's become my highway to hell. Not a highway to hell, but mine. My highway to hell, my reward pathways hijacked in a way that's very detrimental and negative. So This has been the discussion on those pathways, and we're going to stop with that. That this has been a description of kind of what happens and some elements within to give us a more well rounded understanding of what happens with the reward pathways, what happens with dopamine when it fires, and how it drives goal direction or seeking behaviors. And it's not just the drug addict, but also it's the food user, the pleasure user that uses electronics or gambling or other things. And this is just to bring light to those things that if we're not careful, it can get out of hand. And by being aware, that allows us to have an opportunity to develop an intervention or a change of behavior before it becomes too difficult. And just about anything can be conditioned to become addictive. Don't think that it can't be. There have been studies done where really distorted things have occurred that have been documented where people start seeking things that seem really strangely unnatural, but there's a bonding there of the behavior to the pleasure. So we have to be careful and be aware of what goes on with me and with my neighbor and what I see. And it's not about bad person, but realizing, okay, there's something that went on here and there's a reason this is so strong or so repetitive. And sometimes a little compassion goes a long way. And this is really what I'm trying to encourage to break the stigma of what we would call not just mental illness, but a misunderstanding, the stigma of being human and misunderstood. Sometimes, once again, compassion goes a long way. I encourage that in the people that I interact with, and I certainly extend mine to yours. And if you're listening to this, please share it with people. Follow, like, and share. And if you have any feedback to send me, send it to the email runningmangetskillsproject@gmail. And I've certainly enjoyed visiting with you this evening, just sending out the universal love in all directions. And I certainly hope to get some back. You take care. Walk well.